Hello, everyone. Hello, Robert. Welcome to Constellations Conversations with Robert Rowland Smith and myself, Nicola Dunn. So, Robert, we had an array of topics we could talk about, and we've decided that today we'd focus on systemic blind spots.
Indeed.
In a sense, as they may occur both for the issue holder or seeker, but also the constellator, which
Indeed.
makes an interesting element. So, what are your first thoughts, Robert, about that?
Well, before we go into the sort of depths around this, I just want to bring up the notion of the blind spot itself. I mean, I first heard the word when I was learning to drive.
Yes.
And so it takes me back to probably my first driving lessons with my father. So there's something quite evocative for me about that already. And maybe this is my own systemic blind spot. But I do remember very clearly that, you know, you have all these mirrors in the car, but actually there are things that even with these rear view mirrors and wing mirrors, there are things that slip out of view. And actually to see them, you have to make a physical effort to turn around. So it's counterintuitive, it's uncomfortable, and potentially lethal as well, because what comes up in your blind spot, particularly when you're driving, can be pretty worrying. And if you walk down the street these days and you see lorries, you see signs on them saying, please, you know, if you can't see me in my mirrors, I can't see you, and please be aware if this vehicle is turning left or right or whatever. So although that's the literal meaning, I suppose, it's quite interesting because it already leads us into something about what a blind spot, you know, is. That sense of it, it's there, but it's not in our vision. And it's potentially quite serious as well for us if we don't address it. And addressing it involves some intention and might involve somebody else pointing it out, actually. So it is about having a broader view. So I think that's, for me, that's quite an interesting way into it, just a very literal way into it. But I suppose when we are talking about systemic blind spots, we are talking about, generally speaking, I think there may be exceptions, we are generally speaking about individuals in our system about whom we might have a blind spot, or particular conditions, anxieties, or issues which recur in our lives, which we haven't really processed one way or the other. So that's kind of my opening salvo on it. And but I think, Nicola, since you are probably the author, the originator, and the inventor of this term, you should probably claim that and say a little bit more about it from your understanding.
Thank you, Robert. So I think the first time I used it was quite a long time ago when I first started to teach. And I had that sense, exactly as you said, a sort of a moment, a eureka moment. I can't remember if I was in a constellation, running a constellation or whatever, but this sense that to be a player in the life play of your family, of your personal life, you don't have a meta view. It's always a partial view. And as a child, you grow up, you have your own experiences. Many of you may have had that sense of sometimes a bit of dissonance where you felt something, you saw something, you asked something to your parents, and they told you a version of the facts or their own truth that didn't actually quite fit with your own experience. So there was a sense of already that some things were left out, perhaps because they considered you a child and these were adult topics, but you were already in the soup, you were already experiencing it. So there's that initial dissonance. And then, of course, as you get a bit older and a bit more acclimatized to the family, sometimes you buy into the story, into the line that, you know, perhaps that, you know, your father's parents were, different kind of people or unfriendly, and therefore we don't really visit them or talk to them or whatever. And so a branch of the tree is sort of cloaked in some kind of way. Mm. So if you think of a family tree, that the shape that you're working with is lopsided. But because you have been a participant in that family and have grown up in that way, you don't have a clear vision of it. Mm. And I guess that's one of the things that constellations offer, is a meta view And in the process of working with the issue holder or seeker, there is a sense of being able to step back a little bit. That's what the constellator often does, is they change the resolution of the image for the client or seeker. How can we move back a little bit so you can see something that is more inclusive than what you began with?
What you say, Nicola, is so rich already. Firstly, it reminds me of this metaphor that a management writer called Ron Heifetz uses, which is the difference between being on the balcony and being on the dance floor. And most of us spend our lives on the dance floor and not on the balcony. And a constellation is, broadly speaking, a balcony practice, I suppose. But I wanted then to make a distinction between two kinds of blind spot. You said there are things which belong to the adults which aren't material for the children. And I think I remember, I may have adjusted this in my mind, reading a passage in one of Bert Hellinger's books where he says very simply, there are some things not to be shared, that some things belong to the parents and aren't for the children. And them owning that is, in a way, it's a gesture of protection of the children, and that's fine. And I have several times had issue holders who wanted to, as it were, peer into the lives of their sometimes deceased parents in order to winkle out secret in some way. And I've had both outcomes arise. One is a secret has been disclosed, but I've also had the alternative case take place whereby in the constellation I've actually asked the representatives for mother and father to say, this is ours and we'll keep it, in order to save you, or words to that effect. And actually the latter has been a bit more healing than the winkling out of the secret. So that's, for me, that's the first point about this systemic blind spot in relation to, let's say, secrets and appropriate. I'd call them maybe an appropriate secret in some way. The second thing, though, and I'm remembering a particular example, but it's one of several, where at the opening conversation with the client, I have had a strong sense of something, perhaps something dark in that issue holder's past. And I've said, I remember this particular one, I remember saying, is there no history of suicide in your family? And the issue holder was adamant, no, absolutely not. And was kind of surprised by the question. Roll forward 10 minutes, and the constellation is unfolding. We start to bring in extra elements, and the issue holder pipes up and goes, oh, well, yeah, great uncle so-and-so killed himself. For me, that was quite an interesting, I don't know if it fits entirely into the notion of the blind spot, but perhaps it does. Because there was, as you say, a narrative that the issue holder in that case had either suppressed or chosen to redact in some way in order to focus on something else, which I think leads to a broader meta question for us as constellators, how far we go with the material that the issue holder is offering up, as opposed to the thing that material might actually be serving to occlude in some way and therefore conspire with the blind spottery that goes on.
Yes, you've raised some fascinating points. I particularly do love the balcony and the dance floor. It's a beautiful image. I think this is interesting because it also touches, we might another time do a piece about secrets, but sometimes, and I've noticed it often around sometimes sexuality, if it's seen that a parent has been rather unsupportive of an adult child's choices around sexuality, that sometimes putting in an element, I've done this where we added, bisexuality, and then suddenly this parent who has been very critical perhaps of, let's say, for example, a son, suddenly blossoms in the expansion of that being included within the family brain. So I think, I remember the piece that Bert wrote about, what is it that adult children have a right to know, and it is, it's about who their siblings are and who their biological parents are, and but not about necessarily the comings and goings of their parents' sexual life, and because often I'm sure you've done the same, worked with people for whom they have found that burdensome over the course of their childhood, if one parent has been continually speaking to them about that element of their life that somehow draws them into a part of the parent's world that is uncomfortable for them. So I think I think almost what we're saying is a blind spot is something that is material to the life and flow of the issue holder and seeker in front of us. And that is a constellator's choice. And at this point, we're talking about blind spots in relation to the issue holder and seeker. And of course, we'll talk about the constellator in a moment.
What you say there reminds me also of Melanie Klein's work on infant development. And from what I recall, what she says is that if a parent, and I think she is mainly speaking about mothers at this point, if a mother draws the child into their own anxieties, shares with them their own anxieties, even asks the child more or less implicitly to hold those anxieties for the parent, and this can be very young children, not just adult children, the consequence of that can be quite damaging, because that need on the parent's part, the mother's part in this case, annexes space, as it were, in the child's psyche. And so their own room for development is curbed in some way or curtailed in some way. So it's not just about, this is a burdensome thing to hear about, I don't want to hear about my parents' sex life, it's embarrassing or whatever. It's that actually another agenda dominates. So the maternal agenda dominates the child's agenda, and it creates a kind of stunting effect, an impeding of the child's development. So of course, Melanie Klein's talking about this from a specifically psychoanalytic point of view as opposed to a systemic point of view, but I think there's a direct connection there, I suppose.
I would agree. And if I was going to put it into sort of street language, it's you don't get your children to carry your rucksack at that point, your emotional rucksack. It's the same, just having that there are boundaries around these relationships for a reason. At the same time, there is something about truth, because you mentioned suicide, which is a really good topic in this case. That children they're hearing language and they're having sensations, and they're trying to find a match between the two. What does truth feel like? What does non-truth feel like? So how can I negotiate my life, having a sense of what people say and whether that seems to make sense to me? So I think, things like suicide, terminations, etc. There is a point in time and a point of maturity with an adult child when sometimes it is very helpful that these are revealed. Exactly as you said, because it comes out in the constellation, so we sort of see that actually it was wrong.
It's interesting you mentioned terminations. When I first became involved in constellations, I think similar time to you, sort of turn of the century. God, that makes us sound very old. It makes me sound very old anyway. I remember being really startled by the inclusion of, how should we put this delicately, by children who hadn't come to fruition in life. Maybe that's too euphemistic, but they were included, and the inclusion in nearly every case was very healing, because it allowed those children to be acknowledged, and in many cases they essentially formed a blind spot, because often around terminations. As we know, there's shame, regret, quite a lot of difficulty, which isn't easy to share. And I think that might be, I mean, I have no statistics on this whatsoever, but I would imagine, given we live in a world now where people have more relationships, the number of relationships, sexual relationships that people will have is greater than it would have been for my parents' generation, I think. People don't get married so young. They'll have several boyfriends or girlfriends maybe before they get married. They may get divorced and then have further relationships. So again, this is a statistic-free observation, but I'd be surprised if it weren't the case that people had more sexual relationships, and therefore that the number of unwanted pregnancies is perhaps even higher than it might have been in the past. I'm speculating, of course. My point being, there's probably quite a lot of blind spot around these issues of termination. Having said that, I do remember another constellation which I ran, in which it transpired that there were two sisters, but between there was quite a big age gap between them, 8 years or so, I think it was. And between the two sisters, there'd been several terminations. I think it was 3, but quite a number. And being a constellator, I thought, aha, this must be the key in some way. And so we represented them in the constellation. And maybe this speaks to my blind spot, but in fact, it wasn't the key at all. It was a red herring. And in fact, everything had to do with the mother's resistance to the first child, or resistance rather to her becoming a mother when she was still very young. And in a way, the termination was a bit of a decoy. And it made me think the issue holder is bringing that up in order actually to divert attention away from where the real issue lay. So we had a kind of play of different people's blind spots in the room.
Very interesting. So, and you've raised this issue, which I think is great, which is around, sometimes we can get excited about things, as constellators. We say, aha, and pursue something. And it's we're just subtly trying to work out whether is this because the last 8 constellations or 10 workshops have had this element in it? Is it because it's coming from the field? Is it because I have a particular interest or I have a family experience of this? So we're kind of managing quite a lot, aren't we, when we're working? And I think it's an interesting thing, science to constellate to your own systemic blind spot as a constellator, to actually see what you find in there, because what it is not in your current visuals, but it is impacting you. So it's impacting your compass, but not how you perceive yourself as moving forward. So it's an interesting sort of complexity.
Yes.
And as you say, you talked about learning to drive, that, sometimes when you do look into that spot and you see a juggernaut, it's quite frightening, as I say, because it's quite close. And of course, they call that movement of turning the neck as the life-saving movement for exactly those kind of reasons. So, yes, I think it's just always useful to remain curious about what it is that you're not quite open to yourself, perhaps, as a constellator.
Yes, or overly open to. I mean, maybe I don't think it was accidental necessarily if I referred to my father and driving lessons at the beginning, because I'm conscious, well, maybe I'm not as conscious as I should be, that I may have a blind spot around me and my dad, who's passed away now. And it came up again in the constellation not too long ago, where I was sitting next to the issue holder. They began speaking, and again, I had a strong sense of this, overbearing male presence in her life. And this was my blind spot. I immediately inferred father. I said, so your father's quite overbearing then, and, strong and, almost violent. And she said, no, he's a pussycat or something. And I felt suitably chastened and, embarrassed. But of course, when we set up the constellation, as soon as we brought in her husband, he fulfilled every single characteristic that I had, I suppose, perceived or intuited or sensed in some way. For me, that was a real learning, because I felt, okay, I do have a blind spot around that, slightly overbearing fathers like my own, and I need to watch that, Robert. So go with the sense, there's a strong overbearing man in this person's system, but just pause before making that next deduction.
Actually, I think it's a brilliant example, because if I'm a betting woman, so I would bet that that actually she had married a man who had somehow been excluded in that system. So, and when I say excluded, either emotionally excluded, because you can still live alongside someone and exclude them in that way, or more physically excluded. So I think you were right on the money. It was just who it was. That's kind of interesting. And you raise another wonderful point, which is that when one is constellating, one is continually giving oneself notes. And you said, you spoke to yourself in the third person. It's like you say, Robert, I say, Nicola, next time, just remember, pause a little bit more before this. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes, that's right. One does give oneself notes, doesn't one, throughout? I won't do that again, or I'll do more of that, or this didn't seem to work, or that did seem to work. Yes. So we've touched a bit on blind spot of the issue holder. We touched a bit on blind spot of the constellator. Maybe we'll say more about that. I'm sure you've got more points to make. But it made me think just then about blind spots around the circle as well. And I think I'd like, if you're up for it, to have a separate discussion about that, the role of the holding circle. But as we both know, it's not uncommon during the course of a constellation for those around the circle, not all of them, one or two occasionally, to become activated by what's going on. And as a constellator, I'm aware there's a potential blind spot for the constellator in terms of what's happening around the circle, because it's quite absorbing once you're managing a constellation, standing up, reading the body language, maybe liaising a bit with the issue holder themselves. It's possible, I think, for the people in the holding circle to fall into the constellator's blind spot as well, because and I say it's a blind spot because actually there's often critical information that's held at some point around the circle as a site of exclusion or potential inclusion, at least.
Yes, I mean, we're almost, I think, also talking about a collision of blind spots. Titans, at war, because from the holding circles, we said we're going to speak about another time, but you can get very helpful, useful information. We also have people who have represented, and at the end of the constellation, they sit down. And we spoke previously about how the role can take, a few moments to wind out of that person. The roles have blind spots. That's the whole point. They are representing family members who are not doing the constellation from their perspective. So you have your representatives who are sitting down who may feel, quite chastened about how the second wife was treated or responded to in the constellation, because they're still in the role. And the same with the holding circle. You often get very helpful information, and very occasionally you might get someone who says something where I remember once when I first started constellating, someone said to me after the constellation that they were, I don't know, they weren't, I don't know if they were trained or not at that point, but anyway, they said, I'm incredibly surprised you didn't put up the maternal grandmother. And I became fixated on why I hadn't put this person up, and went into a story about how the whole constellation now was a complete misstep. But actually, I got feedback. It took 2 years from that client who said, oh, that was the best constellation I ever had, and this happened after, and this happened after. So they may well have been important, but somehow my not including them or working with that particular entanglement didn't hobble the loving flow of the constellation. So we've talked before a little bit about data, but there is one is taking the information that comes from whoever it is, holding circle, representative, or whatever, and it's going into one's own resonating system. And we have that, I guess, kindly given access to the Ishihara seeker's field, and we're just trying to have a sense of, does it have a place here? Is this important information?
Yeah. We should wrap up in a minute, Nicola, but there's something I just wanted to bring into this as well, which has just occurred to me as you were talking, which is, let's call it the blind spot around death, for want of a better phrase. Now, sometimes there's a blind spot around death in the sense that there is an active ancestor who hasn't been acknowledged or brought in or somehow dealt with adequately. But I think there's as well as systemic blind spots in that sense, there are, I would call, just as we can have appropriate secrets, I think we can have positive blind spots in the sense that we can allow the dead just to remain in the penumbra of the system and not to wake them up, and to allow that to happen. I've certainly seen new constellators, as it were, dig around in the graveyard to try and bring people up and get information out of them. But I feel that the default should be, rest in peace, and be satisfied not to have the information they might be able to provide unless it seems critical. And so in that sense, there is such thing as a positive blind spot, perhaps, just allowing, particularly the dead, just to be where they are and not see them, not to mine them for data always, unless it's necessary.
I think, and you're raising a really interesting point. I think when they ancestors that have passed, when they're in a constellation, you do have that sense, don't you? You have a sense of whether they are at peace. And often I'll say, I have nothing to add here, or I feel perfectly happy. And often it is, as you say, it's more the unresolved relationship for the living with the dead that is more problematic and needs some conclusion, and then they can be left in peace. And there is a sense of, I guess, it's completely up to the ancestors, but a benevolent flow from, across the veil in a way. And as you say, they're not there to be interrogated, but it's really just ensuring that the strands of those relationships have been laid flat in a way that it makes it peaceful for all.
Yeah, exactly. Beautifully said. And probably a good point to bring our conversation to a close today, Nicola. So thank you very much. Thank you for watching. Please do the right social media thing, like and subscribe, because that gives us a bit of incentive to keep going. And do follow up with us as well via our websites, nicoladunnconstellations.com or robertrowlandsmith.com. So thank you again, Nicola.
Thanks, Robin.